Greetings, everyone. This is the second lecture of our exploration towards the cultural systems that the book Forces of Society is about. In the first part, we've focused on the world of matter, and we've went through 5 levels of different emergent systems that operate exclusively within the domain of matter. In this lecture, I'm going to be running us through living systems and where and how within living systems the cultural systems emerge. The first time we went through 5 levels. Within the life, we'll explore 4 levels. We're going to start with cellular living forms. Then we're going to, rather than branch off into multicellular systems, which is what most often we focus on when we want to classify living systems. Considering that we're in the pursuit of cultural systems, our classification starts to change and includes the living systems that are in charge or responsible, if you will, in creating cultural societies. So those would be the worlds of memory regions of animal nervous systems. Now, as I've mentioned before, there's different kinds of quote-unquote memory regions in other living systems, such as trees and fungi, and many probably very much unexplored species of life. And the focus of the exploration of these cultural systems remains in looking within the world of animal systems. So these cultures will be in the animal system. Similarly, as if you would define bacteria and archaea to be in different worlds of living systems of their own. Similarly here, we're starting to focus on specific animals that have certain cultural systems of certain sort. So for example, trees could develop certain processes which are chemical messenger processes. And if they are consistently found and recreated by the world of trees, for example, then that can be maybe classified as some kind of a proto-cultural system. And then after that, we're going to look on when memory regions within animal systems and animal nervous systems start to fire in conflations, meaning when different domains of memory regions start to operate together. Now, as animals move around, they will execute different conflations at different times, which will create routines. And our last level will be exploration of routines as emergent entities, which happen regularly as well, just like we've observed with all the other entities of the different levels of these emergences. Life doesn't really officially start until you have biochemical reactions. And biochemical reactions are defined, at least officially, in the context of there being some kind of a membrane or cellular membrane that wraps up whatever the driver reaction would be or organic reaction would be, and it sustains itself. Now, whether those systems are going to now create colonies, as they're called, bacterial colonies as an example, and then create larger entities is really up to how each one of these emergences or instances of an emergence will express themselves. And from there on, the types of biochemical reactions within living systems that I list here, and there could be many more of, are gene to protein expression, which is how our entire bodies are built on a constant basis, in something that the world of viruses, of course, the language that the world of viruses really understands. Then we've got respiration. Every single living being on planet Earth, including us, has to breathe oxygen, in our case breathe oxygen, but it needs to have a constant sustenance of some. Respiration is just one of the examples. You can have sustenance in interest, which is creating energy in our systems in the form of bringing in extra functional groups and monomers, which come in the form of food. So you have to eat your proteins, and all of that comes in the form of food, which is another intake of energy. And then there's also a very important, the reason why I put nucleus formation in here, because there could be many other molecular networks that we can put in here. I'm just only putting the ones that are going to take us towards cultural systems. The molecular networks that create living systems, because this is life as we know it here. These are molecular networks involved in living systems. The ones that are involved in creating nuclei in cells has enabled creation of multicellular organisms, and a result, an emergence of animal systems that, through cellular networks and biochemical messengers, have created neural systems that went on from there to replicate themselves. So nuclear formation is one of the prerequisites for there to be culture up there, up the levels of climb that we're going through, which is this entire chart here. And we're only at the level here of nucleus formation. As if you see, I actually included those in the process of life straight up, right? So we need to have cells with nuclei in order to emerge everything that is going to get us to culture. Now, cells. What are cells? They're harnessers and protectors of chemical processes, making them biochemical. What that means is a chemical process that finds itself in a membrane, in this case, that is constantly restoring that entity and in some ways protecting it, makes that entity a cell. Even though that the processes that are happening within the cell might be happening everywhere around the world, or around the cell or that environment. Okay. Now, within the official classification of living systems, we have prokaryotic cells, which are cells that have a whole bunch of genes, proteins, and epigenetic tags attached to them within their environment. But there's no nucleus in there. And when the cellular systems evolved to have a nucleus, which in fact held the DNA inside of it, and then the rest of the proteins and everything else was building the cell around, that's when eukaryotic cells were defined as a different cellular emergence, even though they're on the same level, of course. Differentiated cells started happening within colonial systems. Now, it's a very chicken and egg situation yet again in this case, where whether the colony can be considered a multicellular organism that is a larger entity of its own, which does get classified in evolution as multicellular organisms, which are independent. And within the functioning of those, different cells get differentiated to do different kinds of tasks, and they're all managed through the genetic information within the nuclei of the cells. And just to circle these over here are all the different examples of cells that function within an animal system. So you've got nerve cells, you've got skin cells, blood cells, stem cells, muscle cells, sex cells, and so on. And these all play a part in the creation of cultural systems, especially nerve cells that developed an ability to send electrical impulses along the lines of wherever there are neurons, which created a completely new entity, or sort of like a new, it created a new arena of signal transmission that was not genetically based anymore. So genes were not involved, at least not directly, in how the neurons were documenting or saving the charges that were being built up within the neural circuits of the nervous systems. Okay, now we're going to look to the next level. These are memory regions. Memory regions are what I like to call, kind of on the side, are elemental knowledges. And the knowledge is a term is one of those examples where I have a very specific way of how I have defined knowledge, mainly because knowledge is generally defined as an empirical truth. In this context, I expanded the definition of knowledge outside to include subjective knowledges as well, because we can know how it feels to be sad, but that's empirically unprovable or unshowable to somebody who's trying to feel somebody else's pain. Now, we can feel pain through empathy or by invoking it ourselves, or sadness or any other feeling, but those would still be our feelings, but rather than the feelings of somebody else. Observing somebody else's subjective experience is non-empirical. However, I consider them as knowledge. In fact, I consider every neural firing that creates an area within an organism, an animal organism that serves a specific function that can be isolated, a memory region. They're technically our needs, in essence. Like one example would be within our eyes, there is cells that respond to specific colors or specific levels of light. And if there's an area of, say, blue color detection, even though it's a rainbow, everything is gradual. However, within the context of the changing colors within the rainbow of our cellular response, we can isolate a specific area where we can yet again create a bell curve to say where is the majority, where is the 68%, the first standard deviation of blue expression within our eyes. And in that area, I would say that that area would be one memory region that is in charge of dealing with the color blue, per se. Now, there's layers of this within nervous systems of how it works. But as far as the memory regions are concerned, they're embodied, they're in our bodies, they don't move anywhere, and they actually serve a very specific function. George Lakoff was a very good example of somebody who he literally actually defined these different regions as atomic systems that can now cross-bind across domains or within domains to other ones and fire at the same time. And that's conflations, which is what we're going to look at later. But memory regions is the attempt to dial them down to as definable entities as we can within our bodies. And there's thousands of different memory regions. I define memory regions for cultural system in the same way that elements are defined as base units for living systems. So everything starts from memory regions in how the cultural systems are built. And I've divided them generally, just like elements are divided based on properties. I've also grouped different memory region domains. We've got objective experiences. So that's anything that's outside of us, anything that we can measure and be able to empirically observe. That's where the world of truth is. That's where the world of the senses, our like senses is of what we're receiving in objectively. Now, then we've got subjective experiences, feelings, which is technically the same thing, except we're collecting data from within the body. And that what's interesting about both concepts of experience is that even though we have an objective experience of something coming outside that we experience, we are both the objective experience and the subjective experience are our own, are afferent, as they call it. They're aiming in this direction. In fact, a great distinction between input and output when it comes to visceral domains is that input is how we feel, whereas how we emote is what our emotions are, which is classified in the next two entity bubbles. One of them is the objective motions, or simply our movements. So my hand gestures, anything that can be observed physically through somebody else's objective experiences. So somebody looking at us, they can trace our movements. Technically, the visceral motions are also equally motions or afferent output, except that they involve the visceral domains. And there's a crossover here again of whether we would classify microemotions or emotional stances, whether we feel sad or angry or hurt or in pain. All of those are going to come with a specific emotion as well, meaning the face will emote differently. So there's a bit of a crossover, but if it's in the name of displaying the emotional content of the body, that's what I classify as visceral motions. And everything else, like just walking down the street, would be just a straight up objective motion, to just clear the distinction between these two domains. So we have these two as input and output, and then we've got the internal processes, such as social intelligence. So being able to, any domains, neural domains that help us build social interactions around us. And then there are the domains that help us build semantic knowledges, which is the ability to assign symbols to everything, say, that we observe, which is connecting the domains of all these four areas. And finally, we have tissues. Tissues I put here at the very back because tissues are actually the memory regions that run the entire show. I've put them aside. I should have probably put those here in terms of order of how we break everything down. But because tissues are a branch that I'm not particularly interested in, that are not directly involved in organizing cultural systems, I just put them on the side there. This is a side note. Okay? Now, what are the memory regions capable of in animal worlds? Not yet societies, because societies only get created with social animals. And here we are, conflations. Conflations, what are they? They're combinations of memory regions. And specifically, the more I started exploring the world of conflations and how they can be across domain conflations, for example, like when objective experience is conflated with a movement. This is where the Pavlov's world of dogs comes in, which is a simple conditionings that combine different domains of neural activity within the nervous system of any animal. And I loosely call all of those conflations as an umbrella term. This is another example where I'm defining or locking in the definition of a specific word, in this case conflation, because conflation could mean many different things depending on whether you're approaching it from psychology or from a strictly kind of biochemical world or electrochemical and such. Now, in order to build our understanding of conflations, we need to understand how memory regions work, or how the neural network within our body works. And that is that anything that gets reinforced once or more times makes it possible for itself to reinforce itself all that more. So the more of it that there is, more of it there will happen, which is a classic example of how habits are formed, which is the entire process of us existing in the world and moving through the world through the habits that we build, which includes thinking, like one can be habituated into thinking a lot or not thinking a lot. So these are all different conflations that one can establish. A cognitive learning is the first group, which is when you learn something for the very first time, and then you start learning it more and more. Cognitive engagements are kinds of conflations that we already learned, and there's a circumstance where something triggers us to engage that conflation again. And then there's same domain mappings. So technically these are two that are in their own world, and then we also need to point out that any of these can be of either same domain, so you can be moving all the fingers at the same time or wiggling the fingers on the hands in this movement and call this conflation as a same domain, which you can learn for the first time, or you can repeat because you've already learned it. And then there's cross-domain learnings or mappings, which is my ability to, and this is where imitation will come later as one example I'm giving it, which is tracing something and then moving the hand in the same way of how you're tracing something moving, or moving my eyes in the same way as my hand is moving. So these are different domains that can, or thinking about moving the hand and moving it are also technically, or quite literally, two domains functioning in sync with one another. Okay. And then we come to the reinforcements, which is how much, this is another, pretty much all of these definitions of these words I have to lock in. And reinforcement in this case means something that is just simply reinforced, a conflation that is reinforced. Whether it's first time learning, and it'll never get reinforced again, or whether it's something that we already learned and it's getting reinforced again. A reinforcement is something that each one of us has that gets expressed in our personalities in this case. And this is why in brackets I've put traits, to say these are the little traits of how we talk, whether we lean to one side or move, or which ironically used to be understood as the concept of a meme. A meme was just a little idiosyncratic aspects of all the different cultures, the way people would behave. I've come to realize that and define the word meme as a very different thing, which went along with Richard Dawkins's official definition of the meme, which he didn't quite follow through with himself, for some reason abandoning the whole concept. But I think there's a lot of, as Susan Blackmore followed through to look into it, and many other writers, I think that the concept of meme is very, very powerful. And in fact, it actually is as prevalent in the cultural systems as the entity of genes is prevalent in the world of living systems. And there are a lot of parallels. As I will be concluding this entire lecture series, I've discovered that there are many parallels in how these systems operate that are quite similar across different domains. In this case, for example, I've noticed that the conflations are actually similar to what molecules are. And same atom molecules and compounds would be in the same way comparable to what the same domain mappings and cross-domain mappings may be. Let me just zoom in into this area a bit now, which is conditionings and temperaments. A conditioning is a combination of three reinforcements or traits that we have. Okay, one of the essential building blocks, and this is where a conditioning is very similar to some of the monomers that get formed in genetic life, in a way of how there's very specific elements that build monomers, here there's very specific memory regions that are always involved in building a conditioning as defined. In this case, we've got our innate, primary, non-associative reinforcements, which is the things that we were born with, which is what our genes essentially are doing to us. I actually have a diagram here, just to not digress too quickly, and that is that genes actually operate on reinforcements in the traits that we have across 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of emergence. Now, they influence what the cells are going to look like, they influence how the memory regions are going to behave, and they influence how our conflations and our traits in our behavior that is involved in cultural systems is also influenced. So genes have a tremendous influence from the bottom up into how all the systems are operating. This is why the word rasa is so important. That's why I called the manuscript on how I've built this model, cultura rasa, because everything has its essence, and the essence of cultural systems that is about to emerge out of conflations, memory regions and conflations, is directly influenced by the genes of the animals that create them and their essence. So again, we're born with some genetic traits, and then we're born, of course, with the interceptor or visceral reinforcements, which is feelings and emotions. Now, notice that this is also something that it's innate. So genes have, at this point, coded for 2 different domains of behavior, which is one of it is the world of sensory motor reactions and interactions. And then there's the, let's call it the limbic world, although it's much bigger than that. There's certain areas, many different areas in the brain that are in charge of creating our emotions and feelings. But I'll call it limbic as just a shortcut. So the limbic system is in charge of building the visceral element of the conditioning. This is why with the Pavlov's experiments with the dogs, there was always the emotional element as well. And then finally, of course, there's the conditioned secondary associative reinforcement. This is the departure away from the world of life into the world of what cultures could become if this element of newly learned neural schema, if you will, gets to get replicated in the future or not. And an animal can learn through a routine to replicate it regularly, but with the passing of the animal, the behavior passes as well, in which case it doesn't get culturally replicated. Okay, so whenever we talk about conditionings, it's important to recognize that this is a specific molecule, if you will, of memory region domains that operate at the same time. And conditionings are the main molecule. Just like we have the 20 amino acids and 5 nucleotides that create the entire living world, similarly, there's a specific batch of conditionings that create the entire world of cultural systems. So the 2 worlds of conditionings that I want to particularly focus are right here. Those are stories and scripts, cultural values and norms and memes. So those are the things that we observe. This is in the world of experiences. So what we experienced is that it's the important thing to do. And then there's the actual behaviors on where we impose what we've learned onto the world. And this thing can be and is, and especially in human systems, a total self-reinforcing cycle. But we'll explore that more in a bit. And I want to point out one more thing, which is these little Ethos, Pathos logos that I've put in there. Now, I want to point out that especially humans are not very, it's not only that we're good with imitating, we're also good with telling somebody what to do, which is kind of a reverse imitation. And that's where the cultural systems will be locking in. But we're not really at the cultural systems yet, because so far we're only at conflations. And that is just a specific neural circuitry that gets triggered at a certain point to do a specific action, let's say. And the action in the world of sensory motor, I usually call ethos, because ethos is sort of the physical presence of an individual or an animal, and how that physical, whether it's through strength, whether it's through size, it influences the world. And this has been defined by the philosophers back in the day as your kind of like standing within society, your ethos. And your ethos can, of course, this is the modes of persuasion world, which is your ethos can on itself persuade people. There, someone, if it's a matter of alpha animal domination, one might not want to mess around with that animal simply due to the size of that animal. And that would be the ethos of that animal within that specific cultural society or group. And whereas the emotional one is the one that's exerted through the visceral domains. As I've mentioned before, it is an output, except that it's convincing in an emotional matter. And then, of course, whatever we'll learn extra, I classify as logos. Just like nucleotides create different orders of letters that we know all about, similarly, the differences, yet still definable differences of new things that we learn, and this is where language comes out as well, those will actually create new entities that can be replicated in order to aid, for example, in the survival not only of the animal organism, but as well as the society that the animal belongs in. Okay? And then, since we have mentioned traits and how we're all born, how our conditionings are formed as well, there are 5 groups of personality traits that have been defined in the past. Openness to experience, which is curiosity. Industriousness of conscientiousness, because that's how busy you are. Extroversion, social presence. That means how much somebody's present within the social group. Then agreeableness, how much somebody agrees with the group. And then there's neuroticism or unconfidence, which I would call, which is somebody who's not as present, which technically goes against this one. And they would balance each other in the way of how the animals would have evolved. I want to draw the attention to what I originally drew or did the bell curve for, which is this, the 68% there. There's always a balance in terms of how a trait is built. The more of something, the less of its opposite. So, for example, a person who is very curious and independent and inventive will be opposite to a person who's very cautious and then being practical and being consistent. So, and notice how both of those expressions actually can have good merit depending on the circumstances. They can be applied very well. This is where that kind of monomer, naturally occurring element of cultural systems within our own neurology comes in. And our quote-unquote monomer in this case would be how much someone was born cautious. That person's trait, his trait is cautious. And if out of 100 times you see the person, they're 68 times very cautious, then their expression of that trait is statistically significant and worth labeling as an independent emergent entity. Okay, and this is where the observing through time, which I'll explain in a little bit, is very important, and the rate of observance is very important. So similarly, a person who's very industrious, you can somebody who's very disorganized, careless, impulsive, easygoing. Now notice how easygoing gives it a positive twist, which is sometimes from efficiency, organization, and competency, one might just need to take a break. And both are important. It's just a question of how much somebody is a specific way. And we even have words to define that, because if somebody is, say, I purposely took 68% here, in which we say that somebody is, fairly. Fairly would be when the almost like at the first standard deviation, whereas one would be, say, very if it's the second standard deviation, which is the 95% that I put here. And then if someone's 99%, they would say that person is extremely like that. It's like out of 100 times I've seen him, 99 times that person behaved. One day, he had an off day, he didn't behave, but he's like completely always like that. And this is where the language expresses the rate of expression. Percentages express it, and empirical analysis can really show that these things can be counted on and happen regularly, if they do, of course. And similarly, just to finish it off, we have people who can be reserved, solitary, and quiet compared to outgoing, and each one of this can be important for survival, of course. And then as well as being disagreeable, agreeable, and then being someone who's, in this case, secure in themselves, stable, calm, and then someone who's sensitive, nervous, emotional, neurotic. So I try to classify as many of these memory regions that create specific conflations, that create our traits, as I can. And psychology has done a great job to describe a lot of our traits and our temperaments, and which brings me to what a temperament is. I would call a temperament, ironically, our conditioning. I would say that if that person's temperamental, usually we use that is because they have a lot of emotions coming in, but that person's temperament can be very calm. So it's the combination of how they behave and how they emote and what they learn and what they know is that would define somebody's temperament generally. And I, again, defined these words just to lock them in and be able to have a reference to when I speak about a specific domain, so that there will be no confusions. So even though you might think of traits and temperament something else, in my definition, a trait is a conflation that can be defined, whereas a temperament is a conditioning of those three different traits. In this case, somebody moving a lot, emoting a lot, and knowing a lot, or the opposite, or any combination thereof. Okay. Now, where societies really start to happen, and the reason why they happen is because we live in genetically evolved interactive world. So our genes made us social, in which case, because we survived better if we were social. But as a result, all sorts of neural circuits that have to have us keep in a social world had to co-evolve as well. Within any society, two conditionings, if you will. And in this case, when I say conditioning, I mean whether I'm going to get conditioned to feel a specific way about somebody else, and how they will respond to me can have an outcome, three different outcomes. This is classic Gottman bidding system, which is we have the interactive world, which is the bidding toward, which is when we want to connect, but we can also bid toward in an aggressive way. So that's when the bonds get maintained. This is where you can have a toxic relationship, as Gottman explored, or you can have a supportive relationship, depending on how you bid. But it's an interactive bidding system. And then there's the dissociative, which is in the world of ignoring the bid, or just changing the topic, or just abandoning them. What we're left with as a result in the world of exploring different temperaments that can come about within a societal group, which is where cultures emerge, no matter what species of animals we're speaking of. So some charts that I've seen that have been very helpful is to create a quadrant of whether somebody is interested in interacting with somebody else, but also put that interaction with oneself. So the x-axis would be how I see myself. Am I a person who when my temperament is such that I'm going to be an assertive, social individual, and then practice the world of dominance, which, as we'll find out, is a very masculine trait, or whether it would be more in the world of submission or take-caring, of allowing the other person to take charge and dominate, which would be in the world technically of I don't trust myself. But I don't trust myself doesn't necessarily have to be bad in the social circumstance, because if you should trust somebody else, you're putting their trust over yours, which means you trusting oneself again is not a 0-1 game. It's how much one trusts oneself as opposed to trusting someone or something else, and that creates a quadrant of different temperaments people can have. Different names have been proposed. I'm not very fond of the tyrannical, paranoid, and on those ones. I have built my own chart on how to understand this much easier, and in the process see how it all works. So the way I would see it is that there's the need, because again we have to remind ourselves that memory regions are our needs. So every memory region that is expressed in us is automatically our need. So whether those memory regions build a temperament of aggression, that could be a need in order for one to survive. If they're built in the direction of creating a more acceptance, loving interaction, then that will also be genetically pre-coded to survive within that social group. So there's the balance between dominance and power, or strong emotions, so stability, versus the domains and temperaments of submission, which can be called weak emotions. I've seen many different accounts on this, so I've thrown them all in there. And that would be the bidding away world as well. So that's the world of how one treats oneself. And then in terms of how much that individual is interested in the other person, so they'll be interested and friendly versus hating and dismissing, you will have different kinds of temperaments fold out. Okay, I would say that the balance would be in the middle. So it's important to be able to trust somebody else as well as trust oneself. It's important to give attention to somebody else as well, give attention to oneself at different times. So this would be a chart of different kinds of temperaments that exist as emergent domains that replicate, that invoke themselves or reinforce themselves, to use the actual neurological terminology. They reinforce themselves to first standard deviation significance amount within a society. So that person, a chief of a tribe, will be the individual whose neural domains of guiding people will be mostly expressed. And I want to comment really quickly about how this balance distributes itself. This is stepping into the world of societies already a little bit, but since we're talking about different temperaments, a university did a study where they defined specific traits that were mostly understood as masculine. Now, this is regardless of which animal body, of which sex it is. Every animal has a dose of masculine and a dose of feminine. And masculine traits are usually associated with dominance and taking charge, whereas the feminine attributes are more in the domain of sensitivity, warmth, and caretaking. Now, this specific university used these domains. We can probably define extra dozens and dozens in the spectrum. What's important to notice is that everyone has both masculine and feminine dose of each. It's just that the difference are percentually differing and much stronger in the masculine. And that's why one can observe that within the world of temperaments and the balance, people can be more strongly in a society of masculine nature, which is what gives rises to more patriarchal systems, or more feminine, which would give rise to matriarchy. And this is yet again influenced both by genes as well as the previously established cultural systems that run that specific society, because people are very good with being conditioned, which gets established through different conditionings that we have, depending on what's encouraged or not. And we have to remember that this element of learning new things and reinforcing the conditionings to invoke specific emotions and having that from top down can actually do nurture against nature, where nurture can play a huge part in creating an either more masculine oriented society, which would just be more in the world of wanting to dominate and abuse, which is where wars and real harm comes through, whereas the opposite of the feminine would be more in the world of abandonment if one doesn't go with the scripted plan, and they all have their pros and cons in the way they work. It's interesting because it was Erich Fromm that defined the concept of love, the father and mother love, decades ago, where he said that the father love is conditional, means you can earn it, whereas the mother love is unconditional, which means you either have it or not. And with the father love, he said, you can earn it, but with the mother love, if you don't have it, there's nothing you can do. Even though if you do have it, you just have it unconditionally. So they have their both pros and cons. I also see them as the masculine being more of an objective world, which is it's the acceptance of somebody is predetermined by how they behave, which is in the objective world. Whereas in the feminine world of unconditional love, that means that the subjective decides already whether they like you or not. And if they don't like you, there's nothing you can do about it. So both of those traits, and the temperaments, more so in this case, because temperaments are conditionings by definition, they both have a dose in all of us. And in males, born males, the masculine is more pronounced per numbers in terms of statistical observation, whereas in the females it's the feminine traits that are more observed. And I think that this wraps up right now our exploration of living systems in the context of how we're going to build cultural systems. And we're going to now look into routines and how routines create cultural systems.